The wrestler doesn't get up. Nobody in that armory has ever seen him not get up. 3 years on this circuit, twice as many matches as anyone can count, and the man they call the Anchor has built his whole reputation on standing back up. It's his gimmick. It's why people pay to watch him lose, because he never stays down, and eventually he wins anyway on sheer refusal. He's down now, on his back, on the canvas laid over the wood floor of a converted armory, both hands loosely open at his sides like he's forgotten he has them. His breath comes in short pulls. Somewhere above him, a young Chinese man in a torn white shirt is standing with his fists still half raised, chest working hard, staring down at him like he isn't sure what just happened either. 1,200 people paid $1.50 a seat for tonight's card, and every one of them is on their feet, and not one of them is cheering. Because this isn't how it was supposed to go. Everybody in that room who knows anything about how these nights actually work, and by the third bout, most of a crowd like this knows something, understands they just watched a finish nobody wrote. The Anchor was supposed to kick out at 2. He was supposed to no-sell the first 2 strikes and eat the third for the crowd, big and dramatic. And then this skinny newcomer in the black trunks was supposed to get a hero's ovation for going the distance with a legend. Nobody kicked out. Nobody ate anything on cue. Somewhere in the second minute, the whole thing stopped being a show. An usher near the east exit will tell people for years afterward that he heard the sound before he understood it. A flat, wet crack that didn't belong in a wrestling hall. More like something you'd hear from a car accident down the block. He'll say the young man's face didn't change when he made that sound happen. That's the detail people keep coming back to. Not the knockdown. The face. You've maybe heard some version of this. A work match that got real. It happens more than the business likes to admit. Pride, or money, or both. And somebody forgets they're supposed to be acting. Usually it's ugly, and it's over fast, and everybody involved spend the rest of their life pretending it didn't happen that way. This one's different, and here's what gets me about it. The Anchor wasn't trying to hurt anybody that night. He didn't want to be there any more than the ushers wanted to clean up after him. Somebody had already decided how this match was going to end before either man walked out under those lights. And it wasn't the young man in the black trunks who decided it. And it wasn't the big man on his back, either. Stay with me. This takes a minute to get to, and it's worth the minute. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos, in the corners of gyms that don't exist anymore, for men who were young enough that night to still be alive to tell it. Some of them say the debt was $3,000. Some say 5. One old trainer swore to me it wasn't money at all, that it was something closer to a mortgage on an entire city block, and every version of the story agrees on the one detail that actually matters. Somebody was going to get hurt that night no matter what happened in that ring, and it took the 2 men fighting in it the longest to figure out who. I can't prove a word of what follows. Nobody can 3+ decades on, with everyone who was in that armory either gone or unwilling to put their name to it. But the shape of it has outlived every person who tried to bury it, and that tells you something a signed affidavit never could. So let's go back to where it actually started. Not the fight. Before the fight. Because the fight was never really the point. 2 years earlier, and it wasn't a fight that put money in Bruce's pocket. It was a folding chair, a card table, and a sheet of paper nobody in that neighborhood expected to sign. He was 22 years old, running a Kune that occupied the back room of a shop that sold dried roots, ginger candy, 7 kinds of tea, and, if you knew to ask, a decent cut of pork on Fridays. The shop belonged to a man twice Bruce's age who had never once, in all the months Bruce rented that back room from him, asked to see a demonstration. He didn't need to. He'd watched Bruce move boxes off a truck one morning and decided, on the strength of that alone, that the rent could wait if it had to. It had to more often than either of them liked to admit out loud. Here's what the ledgers of small immigrant businesses in that decade rarely show up in anybody's history books. How much of them ran on the good faith of people who couldn't afford good faith? The shop owner covered Bruce's short months. Bruce, in turn, gave free lessons to the shop owner's nephew, fixed the icebox twice, and once talked a health inspector into a longer lunch than the man had planned on taking. It worked the way these arrangements work, quietly on trust, until the day the trust runs into a number bigger than either man can absorb. That number showed up on a Tuesday. A loan the shop owner had taken 2 winters back against the building itself had been sold. The way small debts get sold in cities like this one, from a man you know to a company you've never heard of, and the company wanted its money on a schedule the shop had never agreed to. Bruce didn't find out from the shop owner. He found out from the nephew, who came into the back room during a lesson looking like he'd swallowed something, and Bruce, mid-demonstration, 3 students watching, put his hand down and asked what was wrong before he'd finished the sentence he was teaching. That's the kind of detail that gets left out of the legend, and it shouldn't be. 22 years old, rent of his own he could barely make, and his first instinct on hearing somebody else's debt is to ask how much and by when. By when turned out to be 6 weeks. How much turned out to be more than Bruce had ever held in his life at one time. He tried the ordinary ways first. More students. A demonstration at a community hall that brought in maybe 1/10 of what was needed. A letter to a cousin that never got answered. None of it moved the number by enough to matter. And 6 weeks has a way of turning into 5, and 5 into 4 faster than any of the ordinary ways can keep up with. The offer came through a man named Delgado. Not his real name, almost certainly, but it's the name every version of this story gives him, so we'll use it too. Delgado ran cards for a regional wrestling promotion that filled armories and union halls up and down the coast. The kind of operation that made its real money on side bets nobody printed on a program. He'd seen Bruce demonstrate once at that same community hall, and he had an idea. An exhibition. One night. A real professional. A big man the crowd already loved to hate. Ring name the anchor. Against a striking specialist nobody outside a few gyms had heard of yet. Scripted. Like everything on Delgado's cards was scripted. A worked match. Choreographed down to the last fall. Ending with the newcomer looking sharp and the anchor looking, as always, like he'd refused to stay down until the very last second. The number Delgado offered for one night's work came close enough to the shop's debt that Bruce did the arithmetic twice before he believed it. Here's the thing about a man who has spent his whole short life insisting that a real fighter doesn't perform, insisting on it loudly enough that people who knew him then still repeat the phrase, agreeing in the space of one desperate Tuesday to walk into a ring and perform. He said yes before he let himself think about what saying yes cost him. He told himself it was theater. He told himself nobody watching would know the difference between real skill dressed up as a show and a show pretending to be skill, and for 6 weeks, that lie held together fine. Those 6 weeks looked, from the outside, like nothing had changed at all. Bruce still opened the Kune every evening at 6. He still corrected the same stances, still ran the same drills, still stayed late twice a week to help the shop owner's nephew with a wrist lock the boy couldn't quite get his hand around. Students who trained under him that autumn would say, decades later, that he seemed a little quieter than usual, a little more likely to stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing for a second before picking the thought back up, but nobody thought much of it. A man running a struggling school in a struggling neighborhood has plenty of ordinary reasons to go quiet. What they couldn't see was the arithmetic running underneath it every single night. 6 weeks, then 5, then 4, then 3, each one shaved a little thinner by a letter from the shop owner's lawyer or a visit from a man in a cheap suit who represented, he said, the interests of the new note holder. Bruce kept teaching through all of it, because the one thing worse than a bad decision made in fear is a good school abandoned in fear, and some nights, running through the same wooden dummy drills he'd run 1,000 times before, it was the only hour of the day that felt like it belonged to him and not to the number. It didn't hold together for the two men in the room where the match actually got choreographed. Stay with me. That's the next part. The meeting happened in a room behind the armory that smelled like chalk and cigarette smoke for days before the card, and it lasted maybe 20 minutes, which is not very long to plan out how a man's body is going to move in front of 1,200 paying witnesses. Delgado ran through the sequence fast, the way men who've done this 100 times run through anything, a shorthand of numbers and cues that meant nothing to Bruce the first time he heard it. 2 exchanges to open. The anchor eats a body shot in the 3rd minute, sells it big, comes back with the signature move that made his name, a clothesline that looked like it could take a man's head off and never once actually touched him. And Bruce goes down for a 2 count that isn't really a 2 count, because everyone in the building already knows the finish belongs to the newcomer. Then the reel strikes, 3 of them, fast, clean, landing an inch short every time. Then the fall. Then the ovation. It read on paper like a dance. Bruce had performed forms in front of crowds since he was a child. He understood choreography, understood that landing a strike an inch short is in some ways harder than landing it, because it demands more control, not less. What he hadn't done, not once in his short life, was choreograph a fight with a man twice his weight who he'd met 11 minutes earlier. The anchor's real name, the one on his draft papers, the one his mother used, has been lost along with almost everything else about that night. What survives is a physical impression, a man built like a door frame, hands that could close around a bowling ball, a face that had absorbed a decade of manufactured violence, and looked up close, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the show. He shook Bruce's hand with what Bruce would later describe, to exactly one person, as unnecessary gentleness. The grip of a big man who has learned to be careful with smaller ones, out of habit rather than respect. They talked, briefly, before the rehearsal proper began, the way 2 men sizing each other up for a job will talk when there's nothing at stake yet. The anchor had been on the circuit 11 years by then, long enough to have outlasted 3 different ring names and 1 broken marriage, and he said, almost as an aside, that a night like this, a clean-worked match, a crowd that got what it paid for, a check that cleared, was the whole reason a man stayed in a business this hard on the body for as long as he had. He said it like a man reassuring himself as much as the stranger across from him. Bruce would remember that later and wonder whether some part of the anchor already knew, even then, that this particular night wasn't going to be one of the clean ones. They ran the sequence twice dry, without contact. On the 3rd run, Bruce stopped it himself. He'd felt something in the anchor's timing on the clothesline. A half second where the big man's shoulder dropped lower than the choreography called for, a half second that would put real weight behind a strike meant to travel past him with room to spare. It might have been nothing. It might have been a big man's body simply doing what a big man's body does under adrenaline, gravity, and momentum, arguing with a script written on paper. Bruce didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his instinct, then or ever. He just stopped, looked at the anchor, and said it plainly, "Don't try me." Not a threat, a boundary. The kind of sentence a smaller man says to a larger one, not because he's afraid of losing, but because he understands exactly what it costs both of them if the larger one forgets, even for a half second, that this isn't real. They ran it again. Same shoulder drop, smaller this time, but there. Bruce said it again. "Don't try me." And this time there was an edge in it, the specific quiet edge that people who trained under him later would learn to take very seriously, the one that meant the warning wouldn't be repeated a 3rd time as a favor. It was repeated a 3rd time anyway, not because Bruce chose to, because on the night itself, In front of 1,200 people with lights and noise and a whole card's worth of adrenaline in the building, he felt that same shoulder drop start to happen one more time. And this time there was no rehearsal room to stop and fix it in. There was only the bell, already rung, and a big man's body already moving. 3 times. That's the whole account of what Bruce Lee said to a professional wrestler before either man understood what the next 6 minutes were actually going to cost. Somebody in that armory already knew, though, just not either of the 2 men standing in the ring. 6 minutes. That's how long the match was supposed to run, start to finish, according to the sheet of paper Delgado had walked away with 4 days earlier. Nobody in the building knew that number except the 2 men in the ring and the man selling tickets at the door. Everyone else just knew they'd paid $1.50 to watch a legend get taken to the limit by somebody nobody had heard of. The bell rang. The anchor circled first, big, and unhurried, playing to the cheap seats the way he always did. A wink here, a mock scowl there, the crowd already laughing before a single strike had landed. Bruce circled the other way, quicker, lighter on his feet than anybody expected from the posters, and for the first 90 seconds, everything went exactly the way it had been written in that back room. Setup. 2 feints low, testing distance the way real fighters test distance, even when the outcome isn't in question. Old habit, or maybe just Bruce being incapable of faking that particular part convincingly. Technique. A body shot. Landing soft, more contact than damage, exactly on cue. Reaction. The anchor folded around it theatrically, staggered 2 steps, sold it the way 1,200 people wanted him to sell it, and the crowd roared its approval right on schedule. Then it stopped being on schedule. The clothesline came in the 3rd minute, same as planned, same arm, same angle, and shoulder dropped. Not the small drop from the rehearsal room. A full drop, weight fully behind it. The kind of drop that turns a piece of theater into 6 feet and 240 pounds of a man's whole body arriving somewhere was never supposed to arrive. Bruce's biomechanics saved him before his mind had finished registering the danger. Weight already shifting off the lead foot from the choreography's earlier beat, hips already turning, a half step that was meant to sell a stagger became, in that quarter second, the only thing standing between his skull and an arm swung by a man 3 times his weight. The clothesline caught air where a head should have been. The crowd, seeing only a near miss dressed up as drama, cheered louder than ever. Bruce didn't cheer. Bruce didn't do anything visible at all for about 1.5 seconds. A stillness that, if you'd been close enough to see his eyes, would have told you everything about what he'd just understood. This wasn't nerves. This wasn't a big man's body doing what big men's bodies do under adrenaline. This was a decision made somewhere off to the side of that ring, arriving late and dressed up as an accident. He'd warned him 3 times. There wasn't a 4th warning left to give. What happened over the next 90 seconds is the part every version of the story tells slightly differently. And here's the honest truth about all of them. Nobody in that building, including the 2 men fighting, could have told you afterward exactly what order the strikes came in. That's not evasion. That's what a real fight does to memory. It compresses, it scrambles, it leaves behind only a handful of images sharp enough to survive the years. The images that survived, a strike that traveled a distance witnesses would later argue about for the rest of their lives, somewhere between 6 inches and 2 feet, depending on who's telling it. A sound the usher near the east exit swore wasn't a wrestling sound at all. The anchor's knees buckling not from theater this time, but from something that had actually arrived where it was aimed. One man who trained at a gym 2 blocks from the armory, and who was sitting close enough that night to see faces rather than just shapes, put it to me this way years afterward. He said he'd watched hundreds of worked finishes in that building, knew the rhythm of a fake fall in his bones the way, a familiar piece of music, and this wasn't that rhythm. He said the strange part wasn't how fast it happened. It was how quiet Bruce stayed doing it. No snarl, no roar, nothing that looked like anger. Just economy, like a man closing a door that needed closing. And then the stillness, Bruce standing over a man who had built a career on never staying down, watching him not get up, while 1,200 people who'd paid for a show try to work out in real time, whether they just witnessed the best finish of the year or something they weren't supposed to have seen at all. Here's what gets me about that moment, more than the fight itself. Nobody in that armory clapped. Not one person. 1,200 people who came for exactly this kind of violence, dressed up and safe behind a rope, and when it arrived unrehearsed, every single one of them went quiet. By the time anyone thought to call a doctor, 3 minutes had already passed, long enough in a building with 1,200 witnesses for at least a dozen different versions of what they'd just seen to start forming in a dozen different heads. Bruce didn't leave the ring right away. He knelt instead, one hand flat against the anchor's sternum, feeling for the rise and fall that would tell him the man was still breathing before he'd let himself feel anything else. It came ragged but steady. Bruce sat back on his heels and, for the first time since the bell had rung, let his hands shake. Nobody in that building had trained him for this part. Every hour he'd spent since childhood learning how to end a fight, and not one of those hours had covered what a man does with himself in the 90 seconds after he's ended one for real, in public, against a script that told him it wouldn't happen. Delgado reached the ring before the medics did, and Delgado was not calm. He grabbed Bruce by the shoulder hard enough to leave a mark and asked him, in a voice pitched too low for the crowd, but too sharp for anything except real fear, what in God's name he thought he was doing. Bruce told him the truth, which was that he'd done exactly what was rehearsed and the anchor hadn't. Delgado didn't seem to hear it. He kept saying the word tonight, of all nights, tonight, why did it have to be tonight, in a way that had nothing to do with box office and everything to do with something Bruce couldn't yet place. That detail gets skipped over in most retellings of this story, and it shouldn't be, because it's the first loose thread in the whole night. A promoter who's just watched his card go sideways in front of a full house should be worried about refunds, about the athletic commission, about his wrestlers' medical bills. Delgado wasn't asking about any of that. He kept looking toward the back of the house, toward a row of seats near the exit that Bruce hadn't noticed until just then, for men in good coats who hadn't stood up when the rest of the building did, who were still sitting there, watching, taking no particular trouble to hide that they were watching him specifically. Medics arrived. The anchor was strapped to a board and carried out through the same doorway the wrestlers used to make their entrances. And for a moment, the whole building held the kind of silence that follows a genuine accident rather than a good show, nobody quite sure whether to applaud a man being carried off on a stretcher. Bruce found his own dressing room, such as it was a curtained-off corner behind the boiler, and sat down on the folding chair inside it. And it was there alone, still in his black trunks with his knuckles beginning to swell, that the thing he'd been holding off finally arrived. He'd won. The fight, such as it had actually become, was decisively his. And he felt, sitting in that corner with the boiler ticking beside him, nothing that resembled triumph. He felt like a man who'd been handed exactly what he asked for and discovered, the moment it landed in his hands, that it wasn't what he wanted at all. The curtain moved. It wasn't Delgado. It was the shop owner's nephew, 17 years old, who'd come to collect the envelope of cash on his uncle's behalf and had instead watched the whole thing from the fourth row, and who stood there now with the kind of look on his face that a boy give a man he's just stopped being sure he understands. That's the part one keep coming back to. Not the four men in good coats, though we'll get to them. Not even the anchor strapped to a board. A 17-year-old kid standing in a curtained-off corner, looking at Bruce Lee like he'd just watched something get spent that couldn't be bought back. The kid didn't say anything at first. He just held out the envelope Delgado had shoved into his hands on the way past, thick with more cash than Bruce had ever held at once, and let Bruce take it before he spoke. What he said wasn't cruel. That's worth being precise about, because in every version of this story that leans hard on melodrama, somebody makes the kid say something sharper than what actually happened. What he said was quiet, almost apologetic, the way a much younger person says something they suspect they don't have the standing to say, and says it anyway because nobody else in the room is going to. He asked Bruce if that was what real fighting looked like now. A show, until it wasn't. Money changing hands before the first punch landed. Bruce didn't answer right away, and the reason he didn't answer right away is the whole reason this story gets told at all. If the accusation had been unfair, if the kid had been wrong, if Bruce had simply been an honest fighter dragged into somebody else's dishonest arrangement, there'd be nothing here to sit with. Bruce could have explained himself, the kid could have understood, and the two of them could have split the relief of a debt paid and gone their separate ways. But the accusation wasn't unfair. That's the part that stayed with Bruce long after the bruises did. He had agreed, clear-eyed, sober, with 6 weeks to think it over, to walk into a ring and stage a fight for money. Not to fight, to perform fighting for an audience that believed it was watching something real, so that he could collect a fee large enough to solve a problem that had nothing to do with martial arts at all. He'd told himself it was theater and theater was honest work. He'd told himself the distinction between choreographed skill and staged incompetence mattered, and maybe it did, technically, in the way distinctions matter to the person making them and to nobody else in the building. Here's what gets me about it, and I'll say it plainly because Bruce, to his credit, eventually said it plainly himself, years later, to exactly one interviewer who never used it. He sold the one thing he'd spent his whole short life insisting couldn't be sold. Not his body, his word. The idea that when Bruce Lee stood across from another man, what happened next was real, because pretending otherwise, for any reason, made every other claim he'd ever make about himself a little less solid. The kid wasn't accusing him of losing. Losing would have been easier to forgive. The kid was accusing him of agreeing in advance to make the outcome a matter of arithmetic instead of truth, and then getting lucky that the arithmetic collapsed into something real by accident, in a way that let him walk away looking like a hero instead of exactly what he'd agreed to be for one night, a hired performer. Bruce took the envelope. He counted it once, silently, in front of the kid, because some part of him needed a witness to the fact that he'd actually done this, and it had actually paid what it promised. Then he told the kid to take it to his uncle that same night, before the sun came up, before anyone at the bank or anywhere else could change their mind about what a piece of paper was worth. The debt got paid within 24 hours. On paper, the entire reason Bruce had walked into that ring stopped existing before the following evening. It would take him considerably longer than 24 hours to understand that paying off a debt and settling an account are not, in the end, the same thing at all. Look at it from the other side of that curtain for a second, because the version of his story that only follows Bruce misses why what happened next happened at all. A worked match that turns real isn't just embarrassing for a promotion. It's an existential threat to the entire business model. The wrestling circuits of that era ran on an unspoken contract between promoters, performers, and the audiences who, whatever they told themselves about believing every fall, mostly understood, at some level, that they were watching a story. That unspoken contract only works if everybody involved can trust everybody else to follow the script. A talent who breaks a work, whatever his reasons, becomes a liability no promoter wants near his card, because the entire industry's protection against a very real kind of legal and physical exposure depends on nobody ever finding out how thin that protection actually is. Delgado had to make a choice within days, not because he was cruel, but because he had bookings to protect and other promoters on the same regional circuit who were already asking questions. He quietly let it be known, never directly, never in writing, The way these things always traveled in that world, that the young Chinese striker from the Union Hall card wasn't safe to book on a work show. Too unpredictable. Too likely to turn a controlled spectacle into a lawsuit waiting to happen. It moved through that small, tightly connected world with a speed that still surprises people who don't understand how word travels inside a closed industry. Within 3 weeks, every regional promotion within a day's drive had heard some version of the story, most of them far less flattering to Bruce than the truth actually was. Some versions had him attacking the anchor unprovoked. One version, which persisted for years in gyms up and down the coast, had him doing it for a bigger side bet than the one that actually existed, as though he'd engineered the whole thing himself for profit. Here's the number that matters, and it's the kind of precise number that tends to survive when the vaguer details don't. 4. 4 exhibition bookings Bruce had lined up for the following 2 months, worth in total nearly twice what the shop's debt had been, all 4 of them quietly canceled within a single week. No explanation offered beyond scheduling conflicts that weren't real. That's the inversion nobody sees coming when they hear the setup of this story. Bruce didn't walk into that armory to save a friendship or settle a score. He walked in to solve a financial problem, and he solved it. And in solving it, he destroyed the only reliable income stream that could have kept solving the next one and the one after that. One of those 4 cancellations came in person, which was rarer than a phone call and meant more. A promoter Bruce had worked with twice before, an older man who'd always been fair about the count and generous about the split, drove out to the shop himself rather than send word through Delgado's usual channels. He stood in the doorway with his hat still on, unwilling to come further inside than that, and told Bruce he was sorry, genuinely sorry, that it wasn't personal, that Bruce was as clean a worker as he'd ever booked, and that he couldn't afford, not with a family and a mortgage of his own, to be the promoter remembered for putting a talent in the ring who might turn a Tuesday night into something the papers wrote about. He left without taking off his hat. Bruce stood in that same doorway a long time after the car pulled away, doing the math on what those words meant for the winter ahead, and understanding, for the first time with real clarity, that a reputation built on being unpredictable in exactly the one moment where the business demanded predictability was not a reputation he could survive on. He didn't know yet how much worse it was about to get. Neither did the shop owner, sitting in the back of his own store 2 nights later, going through a stack of mail that had arrived while he was busy being relieved about a debt he thought was finally behind him. 2 nights later, the shop owner sat behind his own counter going through a stack of mail he'd let pile up for a week, relieved enough about the debt being cleared that he almost missed the second envelope sitting underneath the first. The first envelope was ordinary, a receipt, formally worded, confirming that the loan against the building had been satisfied in full. He read it twice, folded it into his shirt pocket, and allowed himself, for the length of one long breath, to feel like a man whose problems were behind him. The second envelope had no letterhead. It named a company he'd never heard of, not the company that had held his loan, not the bank, something new, registered at an address that turned out, when Bruce checked it weeks later, to be a lawyer's office 3 floors above a dry cleaner's. It informed him, in the flat, careful language lawyers use when they want a threat to read like a courtesy, that the same company was now the primary lien holder on 2 other buildings on that block, and that it would appreciate the opportunity to discuss the shop owner's long-term plans for his property. Neither man thought much of it that week. Bruce had his own mail to deal with, for canceled bookings, a growing understanding that the wrestling circuit's doors had shut behind him, and the shop owner had a business to run, and a letter about a stranger's interest in a building he had no intention of selling didn't register, at the time, as connected to anything. It's easy to say that now, knowing what came later. It wasn't easy to say then. Here's what gets me about this part of the story. Nobody in it, not Bruce, not the shop owner, not even, as it turned out, the anchor himself, had the full picture that week. Each of them held one piece of shape none of them could see yet. The way three men standing at different points around a large dark object can each describe accurately what's directly in front of them and still be describing three entirely different things. Bruce, for his part, kept circling back to one question that wouldn't leave him alone. Not why the anchor had broken the script. A man that size, in a fight that size, could break a script for 100 ordinary reasons, none of them sinister. What wouldn't leave him alone was Delgado, and that word he kept repeating in the ring. Tonight. Why did it have to be tonight? He went looking for an answer the only way he knew how at 22, with no money left over for anything fancier than his own 2 feet, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions of people who didn't want to answer them. He started with the men who worked the door at the armory, then the men who set up the ring. Then, 3 days and a great deal of stonewalling later, a hospital orderly who happened to mention, almost in passing, which ward the anchor had been moved to and which visitors had been turned away from it. From men in good coats. Bruce had seen them once from the ring, sitting still while a full house stood. He was about to learn who they were, and the answer would cost him considerably more sleep than the fight itself ever had. Add one more name to the equation, and the entire night rearranges itself. The 4 men in good coats belonged to an operation that had nothing to do with wrestling and everything to do with what wrestling made possible. Every worked match on Delgado's cards carried a predetermined finish, which meant every worked match also carried for men willing to pay for the information in advance, a wager with no actual risk attached, a bet on a certainty dressed up as a gamble, sold at real gamble odds to marks who had no idea the outcome had been decided weeks earlier. It's an old trick, older than wrestling, older than boxing, older probably than any sport that's ever had money attached to it. Somebody who knows the ending sells confidence to somebody who doesn't. The 4 men in good coats ran that trade up and down the regional circuit quietly, profitably for years before that Tuesday, and they had, according to what Bruce eventually pieced together from the hospital orderly and 2 other sources who'd only talk if their names went nowhere near this story, placed an unusually large amount of money that particular night on a very particular outcome. Not on the anchor winning. The finish already guaranteed that wouldn't happen. They'd bet on how badly the newcomer would be hurt doing it. Specifically, that the young striker who'd been getting a little too much attention on the local circuit lately would leave that ring on a stretcher of his own, dramatically, publicly, in a way that would end whatever momentum he'd started building. That's the part that reframes everything that came before it. The anchor hadn't broken the script out of pride or nerves or a big man's body doing what big men's bodies do. He'd been told to, paid to, or threatened into it. The distinction mattered less to him in the moment than the fact that he owed the men in good coats a debt of his own, one considerably older and considerably larger than anything the shop owner had ever carried, and they had made it very clear what would happen to him if he didn't make sure Bruce Lee left that ring looking finished. He'd tried, in his own way, to warn Bruce without warning him. That's what the shoulder drop was in the choreography room. The first 2 times, not aggression, not carelessness, but a big scared man testing again and again whether there was any version of that night where he could follow his orders without actually following them all the way through. Bruce's 3 warnings hadn't been received as a threat from a smaller man to a larger one. They'd been received, though Bruce couldn't have known it then, as a lifeline he was too frightened to take. Here's what gets me about the 4 men in good coats. More than the money, more than the violence they paid for at arm's length without ever touching anyone themselves. It's the smallness of the whole operation set against the size of what it broke. 2 lives, a big man's and a young man's, bent completely out of shape by a wager that probably ran, when you add it all up, to less than the price of a decent used car. That's the part that never makes it into the version people repeat at dinner parties. The myth wants a grand villain, a criminal mastermind worth the drama. The truth, when you can get close enough to it, is almost always smaller and stupider and sadder than that. By the third attempt on the night itself, with the men in good coats watching from seats near the exit, the anchor stopped testing and did what he'd been paid to do. He failed. That's the detail almost nobody who tells this story gets right, and it's the one that matters most. The anchor didn't lose control that night. He tried, as hard as a terrified, indebted man could try, to follow through on the one thing he'd been ordered to do, and he still couldn't finish it because the man across the ring from him turned out to be better and faster and considerably more prepared for real violence than either the men in good coats or the anchor himself had accounted for. That's a different story than the one the crowd left the armory believing, and it's about to get more different still. For days passed in silence. No visit, no message, nothing from the hospital ward the orderly had pointed Bruce toward, until the fifth night when a knock came at the back door of the shop after closing, quiet enough that Bruce almost mistook it for the building settling. The anchor stood in the alley, one arm still strapped across his chest, a bruise along his jaw that had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do, Bruce would learn, with a conversation he'd had with the men in good coats sometime in the 2 days after. He didn't come inside. He said what he'd come to say, standing in the cold, glancing twice down the alley toward the street, the posture of a man checking, out of habit now rather than paranoia, whether he'd been followed. He hadn't come to apologize, and he said so plainly, in a voice that had none of the showman's boom left in it, just a big, tired man talking quietly to another man he'd nearly hurt for money. He'd come because he owed Bruce something more useful than an apology, and he didn't know how much longer he'd have the nerve or the freedom to deliver it. He told Bruce about the debt, not the amount. He wouldn't say the amount, not that night or ever, though it would later be estimated at something considerably larger than what the shop owner had owed, but the shape of it. Years old, inherited from a brother who'd gambled it into existence and then left town, leaving the anchor to either pay it or answer for it with his body, the way men in that world answered for things when money ran out. The men in good coats had come to him 3 weeks before the card with an assignment dressed up as a favor. Make sure the new kid doesn't walk out of that armory able to keep building what he's building. Do it inside the show where it looks like an accident and the debt gets forgiven. He tried to do less than that. He told Bruce this with something close to shame, that he'd hoped right up until the bell that he could throw the match hard enough to satisfy the men watching without actually finishing what they wanted finished. And that hope was the reason his timing kept slipping in the rehearsal room. 3 separate times, each one a smaller, more cowardly version of the same failed attempt to warn Bruce without warning him. Then he said the thing that mattered most, the reason he'd risked the alley and the cold and whatever it cost him to be seen anywhere near Bruce Lee again. The men in good coats weren't finished. Whatever they wanted from that night, they hadn't gotten it, and men like that don't walk away from failed investment. They recalculate. He didn't know what the shop owner's letter about the holding company had to do with any of it. He didn't know there was a letter at all. But he knew, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent years owing money to people who collect on debts with more than paperwork, that whatever this had actually been about, it had never really been about a wrestling match, and it had never really been about Bruce Lee either. Then he left, back down the alley, favoring the arm that wasn't strapped, and Bruce never saw him again. Not that year, not the next, not ever. In fact, though every so often for the rest of his life, Bruce would ask of anyone who might conceivably know, whatever became of the big man who tried 3 times to warn him and failed the 4th. Nobody ever had an answer. On paper, a wrestling match. In a ledger's 3 floors above the dry cleaners, something else entirely. It took Bruce and the shop owner most of the following month, working evenings after the shop closed, to assemble a picture that made any sense at all. And they only managed it because the shop owner, unlike Bruce, had spent 2 decades in that neighborhood learning who owned what, who owed whom, and which names on which papers were fronts for other names that never appeared anywhere at all. The holding company that had bought the shop's original loan, the one that had triggered the whole crisis in the first place, the debt Bruce had gone into that ring to pay off, turned out to be the same holding company that had, over the preceding 18 months, quietly acquired liens on 4 other properties along that same block. A tenement 2 doors down, a machine shop on the corner, a rooming house that had stood there since before the war, and now, per the second, unmarked envelope, an interest in the shop itself, framed as a courteous inquiry about long-term plans. Here's the number that made the shop owner go very still when Bruce finally laid it out for him on a piece of butcher paper at the counter one night after closing. 5. 5 properties, forming an unbroken run along one side of that block. Every single one of them now under the same quiet ownership, and every single one of them acquired not through a fair offer made to a willing seller, but through debt bought cheap, and then squeezed until the owner had no choice but to sell or lose the building outright and get nothing at all. The shop had been the 5th piece. And the 5th piece had, for reasons that had nothing to do with martial arts, and everything to do with a set of books somewhere the 2 of them would never see, needed to come apart from the rest in a way that looked like bad luck rather than a coordinated squeeze. Take a step back and look at what 5 contiguous properties on one block are actually worth once they're empty and can be sold as a single parcel instead of 5 separate headaches. It's not a small difference. A developer buying a tenement, a machine shop, a rooming house, and 2 more storefronts one at a time, from 5 different reluctant owners, pays 5 different prices shaped by 5 different negotiations, any one of which could fall through. A developer buying one clean, vacant block from a single holding company pays whatever that company decides to ask, with no negotiation left to have, because there's nobody left standing on that block to negotiate. The difference between those 2 numbers is where men like the ones in good coats make their actual living. The wrestling match, the debt, the $2 tickets, none of it was ever the point. It was overhead. That's where the wrestling match came back in. And here's the part that reframed the entire story for Bruce, sitting at that counter at close to midnight with a piece of butcher paper covered in names and arrows. The men in good coats hadn't needed Bruce hurt because of anything Bruce had done, or because of any grudge, or because of a bet gone wrong in isolation. They needed a public incident. Something loud enough, embarrassing enough, connected closely enough to that block and that shop to draw exactly the kind of official attention. Police reports, an athletic commission inquiry, a local paper's 2 paragraphs about a wrestling exhibition gone violently wrong that would make the whole arrangement look from a distance like an unrelated run of bad fortune rather than what it actually was. A young striker getting badly hurt in a shady exhibition tied to a shop that couldn't pay its debts would have been perfect, quiet, deniable, and it would have kept the block's troubles looking like isolated misfortune instead of the coordinated campaign it actually was. Bruce winning instead, winning decisively, publicly, in a way that turned the story into a fighter's triumph rather than a cautionary tale, had broken their plan cleanly in half. It should have been good news. Bruce sat with that thought for a long moment before he understood why it wasn't. Here's what tips the scale, and it isn't money, not directly. It's attention. A quiet debt, patiently squeezed, patiently sold and resold between shell companies until an owner has no fight left to offer, works only for as long as nobody outside the arrangement is looking closely. The moment Bruce's win turned an obscure regional wrestling card into 2 paragraphs in the city section, a headline no bigger than a thumbnail, an exhibition match gone unexpectedly violent, a promising young martial artist, an injured veteran wrestler carried out on a stretcher, It put a small, uncomfortable amount of light on an evening the men in good coats had needed to stay entirely dark. An athletic commission clerk, doing nothing more dramatic than his ordinary job, filed a routine inquiry into the card's promoter. The inquiry touched, however briefly, on financing, where the purse money for the exhibition had come from, who had underwritten it, which accounts the numbers ran through. It went nowhere officially. It was closed within 6 weeks for lack of any clear violation. But for 6 weeks, a very quiet, very patient operation had a government file open on its bookkeeping, and men who move money the way the men in good coats moved it do not wait around to see how thoroughly a clerk decides to read a file. They accelerated. The holding company's lawyer, the one 3 floors above the dry cleaners, sent the shop owner a formal notice within the month. Not a courteous inquiry this time, but a call on the underlying lien. The one Bruce's fight money had supposedly settled in full. It turned out when the shop owner finally paid a lawyer of his own to actually read the fine print on that original loan sale, that the debt Bruce had paid off was only ever the first of 2 instruments attached to the building. A smaller one, deliberately structured to look like the whole obligation, while a second, larger lien, buried in a separate filing at the county recorder's office, remained entirely intact and entirely enforceable. Bruce had walked into a ring, absorbed a real fight nobody warned him was coming, and handed over a purse large enough to clear what looked, on every document anyone had shown him, like the entire debt. He had, in fact, cleared perhaps a third of it, the third that was ever meant to be visible. That's the reveal that undoes the whole shape of this story, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we go on. The men in good coats never needed Bruce to lose that fight in order to get what they wanted from that block. Losing would have helped, certainly. It would have kept things quiet a while longer. But the structure that actually mattered, the second lien nobody but a lawyer 3 floors above a dry cleaner's had ever seen, would have come due regardless of what happened in that ring. Bruce's fight hadn't been the mechanism of the loss. It had only ever been the noise that decided how loud the ending would be. Weeks pass in a kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. The shop owner fought it the only way a man in his position could fight anything by then, a lawyer he could barely afford, a filing that bought 60 additional days, a series of letters written in the patient, hopeless language of somebody trying to reason with an arrangement that was never designed to be reasoned with. None of it changed the outcome. The second lien was real, properly filed, entirely legal in every particular a judge cared about, and the judge who eventually heard the matter took less than an afternoon to rule that it stood. Bruce sat through that hearing in a back row, in a suit that didn't fit him quite right, and said nothing, because there was nothing a 22-year-old martial arts instructor could usefully say in a courtroom about a financial instrument he'd only learned existed a month earlier. The room smelled of radiator dust and old paper. A ceiling fan turned so slowly it seemed decorative rather than functional. The shop owner sat up front beside his lawyer with his hands folded in his lap. Very still, the specific stillness of a man who has already decided, somewhere in the last sleepless week, that dignity is the only thing left in this proceeding he still has any control over. Here's what gets me about this part of the story, more than any of the ones that came before it. Everybody in that courtroom, the judge, the lawyer, the clerk taking notes, believed correctly that they were watching an ordinary foreclosure proceeding. Nothing about the paperwork in front of them said syndicate or squeeze or wrestling match. The violence in that armory, the men in good coats, the debt inherited by a scared big man from a brother who'd vanished. None of it appeared anywhere in the official record of how that shop came to change hands. It simply looked, to anyone reading the file afterward, like a small business that had borrowed more than it could repay and lost the building as a result. That's the version that survives in whatever records still exist. It's the version that would survive if you went looking today. And it's wrong, or at least it's incomplete in a way that matters. But proving otherwise would have required exactly the kind of evidence that four men in good coats had spent a great deal of money and considerable patience making sure never existed in a form anyone could point to. The shop closed on a Thursday in early spring. Bruce helped carry out the last of the dried roots and the ginger candy jars himself. Boxes he'd carried in the other direction 2 years earlier as a favor that had turned, eventually, into a rented room, and then into a school, and then, for one terrible, well-lit night, into a debt he'd fought a stranger to pay off. The back room went with it. The Kune, Bruce's first real school, the one he'd built up over 2 years of teaching in exchange for rent he mostly couldn't afford, the one the fight had been meant to save in the first place, closed its doors the same week because there was nowhere left for it to be. He'd won the fight. Every account of that night agrees on that much. The one detail nobody argues about. He'd won it clean, for real, against a man twice his size who'd been paid to make sure he didn't. And 6 months later, he was teaching out a borrowed garage on the other side of town, starting again from nothing because the thing he'd fought to save was gone anyway. Not despite what happened in that ring, but in the strangest and most bitter arithmetic of the whole story, partly because of it. The kid came to find him once more, weeks after the garage and the new part of town had become the school's new address. And this time neither of them needed an envelope to make the conversation happen. He'd grown up considerably in the space of that one winter. Old enough now that Bruce found himself, for the first time, thinking of him less as a boy who'd witnessed something and more as a young man working out, in real time, what he believed about the adults around him. He asked Bruce the same question he'd asked in that curtain corner behind the boiler, almost word for word. Was that what real fighting looked like now? A show, until it wasn't. Bruce had an answer this time. He hadn't had one that first night, sitting in his trunks with his knuckles swelling, and the 6 months since had given him nothing but time to sit with the question properly. He told the kid the truth, as plainly as he'd once told the anchor, "Don't try me." Yes, he had agreed to perform. He had told himself it was a small enough lie to tell, one night, for a good enough reason, and he had been wrong about that. Not wrong that the reason was good. The reason had been about as good as reasons get, a friend shop, a debt neither of them had chosen, but wrong that a good reason changes what a lie costs the person telling it. He'd learned something else in those 6 months too, something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure, even now, that he entirely believed. The shop would very likely have been lost regardless. The second lien had been sitting in a filing cabinet at the county recorder's office since before Bruce ever walked into that ring, waiting on its own schedule, attached to a plan that had nothing to do with wrestling matches or striking specialists or the particular pride of a 22-year-old who thought a fair fight could fix an unfair situation. Winning hadn't caused the loss. It also hadn't prevented it. The two things, his integrity and the shop's survival, had never actually been connected the way he believed they were on that desperate Tuesday when Delgado first made the offer. That's the part that took him the longest to sit with, and it's the part one think about more than any fight choreography in this whole story. Bruce had gone looking for a trade, his skill dressed up as a performance, exchanged for enough money to buy somebody else's safety. The trade had gone through exactly as arranged. He'd paid and gotten paid, and everyone involved had honored their side of a shabby little bargain. And none of it had mattered because the actual threat had never been inside that ring at all. The kid asked him, finally, whether he regretted it. Bruce thought about that longer than about anything else in the conversation, longer than the question probably deserved, and then he said the thing that people who trained under him in later years would hear him say, in one form or another, more times than they could count. He didn't regret trying to save something worth saving. He regretted, and would keep regretting for the rest of his life, believing for even 6 weeks that there was a version of himself who could be bought for one night and rented back out again the next morning, no worse for the transaction. There wasn't. There never had been. That was the lesson the whole bitter arithmetic of that winter had been trying to teach him. And it had taken a shop closing and a school moving to a borrowed garage for him to actually hear it. Here's what I keep coming back to. Turning this story over the way you turn a coin, looking for the mint mark that tells you whether it's real. Every version of it, the one about the anchor, the one about the shop, the one some old trainer swears involves a mortgage on a whole city block instead of a modest little shop that sold ginger candy and 7 kinds of tea, agrees on the shape of the ending, even when it argues about everything leading up to it. A young man wins a fight he was tricked into. The thing that fight was supposed to save gets lost anyway. Nobody in the story gets to feel good about any of it. Not even the version where he wins clean. That's not how these legends usually go, and I think that's exactly why this one refuses to die. Most of what gets passed down about Bruce Lee, most of what I've told you across all the nights we spent together, in Somewhere Warm, he humbles the man who underestimated him. He earns the respect of somebody who came at him wrong. Even the losses, the real human losses, tend to resolve into a lesson he carries forward, a wisdom that makes the cost feel worth paying in the long run. This one doesn't resolve. That's the whole point of telling it to you honestly, instead of doing what every instinct I have as a storyteller wants me to do, which is to find you a silver lining and hand it over at the end like a receipt. There isn't one here. He fought for real against a man forced to try to hurt him, and he won. And the school closed anyway, 6 months later, in a borrowed garage on the other side of the city that had already moved on to the next thing worth talking about. The anchor vanished from every record anyone's ever managed to find. The men in good coats got their 5 properties, eventually, one way or another. The story doesn't survive clearly enough to say exactly how, and I won't pretend it does. The shop owner started over somewhere else, smaller, further from anything. And if he ever spoke about that winter again to anyone besides Bruce, it isn't written down anywhere I've been able to find. One detail people who tell this story do agree on, for whatever that's worth. Years afterward, long after the borrowed garage had become something bigger and the bigger thing had become something people paid to watch, Bruce would still occasionally stop mid-demonstration in front of a full room and go quiet for exactly as long as it takes to close a door that needs closing. Students who trained under him at that later school never knew where the habit came from. They just knew, the way you know a teacher's particular silences mean something, that it wasn't nerves and it wasn't showmanship. It was a man remembering for a second or two at a time, a night when winning turned out not to be the same thing as saving anything at all. Now, how much of this actually happened? Honestly, almost none of it, at least not the way I've told it to you tonight. This is a legend, dramatized and largely imagined, a story I tell you, inspired by the real Bruce Lee and the real, brutal economics of the world he came up fighting in, not a record of him. I don't have a signed affidavit. I don't have a letter from a lawyer 3 floors above a dry cleaner's. What I have is a story that's outlived every person who might have told it straight, and a shape to it that keeps getting repeated decade after decade by people with no reason to agree on it unless something underneath it was true. Here's what I think is true, and I'd bet my life on this part, even though I can't prove a word of the rest. There was a young man, early in his life, poor enough and loyal enough to agree to something he knew was beneath him for somebody he cared about. And it cost him more than he bargained for. Not because he lost, but because winning was never actually the thing that would have saved anybody. Some fights aren't rigged against you by the man standing across the ring. They're rigged against you somewhere else entirely, by people you never even see. And you could be perfect, flawless, honest, better than anyone in the building, and still lose the thing you came to save. That's not a comfortable lesson. I don't think Bruce found it comfortable either. But I think it's the reason whatever he actually built afterward in that borrowed garage and every school that came after it, he never again agreed to let anyone tell him in advance how a fight was going to end. You already know where this goes if you've watched enough of these stories with me. Somewhere down the line, the myth smooths this over. Somewhere down the line, somebody tells a version where the shop gets saved after all, where the developer's plans fall through, where the kid grows up to run the new location himself. I've heard versions like that. I don't believe them, and I don't think you should either, because a legend that only ever lets its hero win is a legend that stopped being about a person and started being about a product. That's the myth doing its work, smoothing, softening, reaching for the ending everyone wants instead of the one that actually teaches you something. Maybe it happened close to the way I've told it. Maybe it didn't happen at all, and some tired old trainer just needed a story that explained why the young Bruce Lee he half remembered had that particular look in his eye whenever anyone mentioned wrestling. I can't settle that for you. Nobody can this many years on. But the man underneath it, the one who paid a debt honestly and lost the thing it was meant to protect anyway, and kept teaching regardless, in whatever room he could find, for however long it took to build something new. That part, I bet my life, is real. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do. Until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.